Hello and welcome to the EXP Required podcast, where we talk about Final Fantasy and other things. My name's Jack, and as always, I'm joined by Mol. How are you doing, Mol?
I'm not too bad today. It's been bloody cold. I feel like all I do is complain about the weather, so I've got to keep that one up. It's been frosty where I am, which has been a welcome surprise. Now that we're post-Christmas, the whiteness is coming back into play. But there is one thing, Jack. You've called me the wrong name today.
Did I really?
Yeah, I'm not going by Mol today. My name's Jack today.
Yes, we're all Jack today because we are joined by AlleywayJack, and I'm Jack. We're all Jack. You're Jack too.
Jack.
Everyone listening's Jack today. How are you doing, AlleywayJack?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
Yeah, very good.
In the interests of making sense of who's speaking and who's being addressed, you can call me Will, if you want.
Wonderful.
Very, very nice. Thank you so much for joining. It's been looking forward to this since before Christmas. So yeah, obviously we're going to talk a bit about your sort of content and your stuff and really focusing on Final Fantasy X at some point. But first, I guess, question for you would be just, well, can you give yourself a brief introduction of what you do and what your stuff is and all that jazz?
Yeah, sure thing. So I go by the name AlleywayJack on YouTube, and my content is ever evolving, really. I mean, I've been around for a few years now. Generally used to discuss games, do kind of reviews and retrospectives of games, and it was a bit of a 50-50 split between Final Fantasy and other stuff. So everything from Metal Gear Solid to Tekken to Ghost of Tsushima, so on and so forth. It's just gradually become more narrowed and more focused on Final Fantasy, and within that I tend to speak about game mechanics, story structure, and character-specific sort of discussions across various Final Fantasy games. Yeah, that's the long and short of what I'm doing.
Brilliant. No, definitely good stuff, enjoyable stuff. I've noticed, obviously, like, watching your stuff for a while, you're quite eclectic in what you do. I mean, there's digging into it, you sort of talk about character analysis, you also talk about game analysis and, like, game design analysis and stuff like that. So I guess, is that something you're keen about doing, or do you just sort of, like, focus on whatever takes your fancy at that time?
Yeah, it's a good question. It is kind of what takes my fancy at the time, because I tend to play through the games quite often, and I play back through them sort of annually, if not biannually, quite a lot.
Hell yeah.
I was always interested in stories. I was always interested in characters. That's what first sort of drew me to the Final Fantasy games. But as I sort of moved forward in like my professional career outside of gaming and whatnot, which is to do with user experience design, UI design, and things like that, I started kind of looking at the games with that in mind as well. So looking at, for example, how they handle wayfinding or onboarding, or how certain systems work, like whether it's the junction system or materia systems and things like that. So yeah, I tend to have, at first, sort of discussing Final Fantasy was an escapism from my professional career, because I wanted to talk about characters and stories and things. And then I realised how actually my professional career can be applied to discussing Final Fantasy and games in general as well. It's kind of eclectic, and it depends what I sort of take from a game on each playthrough.
I kind of hard relate to that a little bit.
In that sense, then, obviously, you've just said that you work with UX and UI stuff in your professional life. What kind of stuff do you notice when you play games, then? Because, I mean, I can only speak for myself. I don't have any kind of background like that whatsoever, so it isn't the kind of thing that I notice when I'm playing games. So I'd love to know what kind of stuff you notice specifically.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, as I say, sort of onboarding things, how gamers, audiences are sort of guided through a game, how they are introduced to a game and things. So we spoke before recording about how much we all love Final Fantasy VIII. I love that game, even though some people, it's one of the more controversial ones. Some people perceive it to have some shortcomings, which I sort of don't agree with or just overlook.
Yeah, they're wrong.
Let's just agree that they're wrong. But for example, looking at it from a kind of UX perspective and looking at how they onboard us to the junction system, for example, which is basically Quistis standing in the entrance to garden going ba 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 ba, and it's just dialogue box. That would be considered possibly a negative, and it is quite laborious to sort of understand the junction system for a lot of players. Whereas some other games, they sort of guide you into it. For example, you'll have that first battle. I'm actually playing through Final Fantasy XII at the moment, so I've just finished
Excellent
Final Fantasy
choice.
X. Yeah, I'm going back into Final Fantasy XII. I love the Ivalice games. I love Tactics. I love 12. But for example, we have that segment with Rex at the beginning. So we're introduced to Bash and the sort of circumstances of the war from a narrative perspective through Rex at the beginning, but also we're being taught how to use the battle system in Final Fantasy XII, and it's a bit more hand-holdy than perhaps Final Fantasy VIII was. Again, they are not quite a decade apart, but there are obviously considerations around technology and limitations that we take into account. But yeah, so they're the sort of things that I notice, and it's kind of annoying as well, because it's kind of sometimes it's hard to appreciate the game just as an experience, because I'm looking at it from that viewpoint.
It's quite interesting because on the 8 thing, I did a dive. I talk about this quite a bit actually. I did a bit of a dive into the Final Fantasy VIII demos, because I'm sure you're familiar, we got a demo in official PlayStation magazine of the Dollet mission, but the North American and Japanese audience got the Dollet mission but slightly differently, an earlier build of the game. And if you play either of those versions, especially the one we got, which is a bit more refined version towards the game's release, the game starts you off at Dollet with a bunch of magic already. And then in the battles with the Anaconda and stuff like that, it says, right, draw magic this way, and basically as you go up the mountain, you kind of learn the game mechanics. A little bit of that's still there with the whole give the EXP to Cypher on the, or Cypher or whatever you want to call him, but it's Cypher for me. As you go up, and it teaches you that game mechanic. But it seems to me like, I don't know, because I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth, but because I guess Final Fantasy VII was such an impactful, massively huge sort of the start of the game, punched straight into the action, I think they were going for a different vibe with 8, and I think they decided at some point later on, let's not make Doll at the beginning of the game. So that might be an influence on that. I don't know if you've got any takes on that at all.
That's very interesting, and I hadn't considered that before. But thinking about the FMV, where you arrive at Dollar, you've got Squall on top of the sub, and you jump straight into the action. I could see that being an intro to a Final Fantasy game, because as you say, Final Fantasy VII throws us straight into the reactor mission. Final Fantasy IX throws us straight into kidnapping Princess Garnet, and they do have a habit of throwing us right into the midst of action. And I actually liked what they did with the intro, actually, with Final Fantasy VIII, because we had the action as an FMV sequence, which is Squall sparring with Cypher, and we had this beautiful montage going on, which they hadn't really done before, because all of the intros leading up prior to Final Fantasy VIII were basically just showing us the introduction to the action, so the train arriving in Midgar, all of that sort of thing, whereas Final Fantasy VIII was much more cinematic, and it was a montage of sort of events that hadn't happened yet. And then we have this beautiful reprieve where it's just Squall in the infirmary with the birds tweeting and the curtain blowing and stuff. It was so scenic and serene. I loved that step change.
Yeah.
I know from a narrative standpoint, you want to chuck someone in right at the deep end, in media res, you want to get that action out of the way. That draws the person in, and then if you give them that moment to sit down and just absorb it while very little is going on, that makes it a lot more punchier for me. And I mean, I'm only speaking from a narrative sense, but I really like being able to sit and digest what I've just been shown, especially when it's that punchy and cinematic as well. And then knowing that I'll get around to understanding that later, that helps draw me into the world. I think I'd probably change stuff about FF8's opening if I was going to go back to it and like redesign it from the ground up. I think I might start it in Dollet, but have the post-Dollet mission be a lot more chilled, do the balance stuff after Dollet. I feel like that would be a really good way to... But we were supposed to be talking about Final Fantasy X today. How have we started talking about 8? Jack, this is your fault.
No, I will take some of the blame here, because what you'll notice is even when I have sort of the more generalised episodes on my YouTube, I find a way to crowbar it or frame it into Final Fantasy VIII. So for example, when Final Fantasy VII Rebirth came out, and obviously they had Queen's Blood, the card game, on there, I was like, wow, this would make a great excuse to talk about Triple Triad and whether... So I did a comparison episode, yeah.
That's really cool. I mean, the thing is, though, I mean, like, we obviously try and compare the games together, and I think that's quite interesting, especially having played a lot of them through, or certainly finished a lot of them recently, because I've never rolled credits on a lot of things. That's perpetually my problem. I tend to start things and never finish them. Start everything and never finish it. But no, I've rolled credits in the last year on a lot of the Final Fantasy games, and I've played them sort of sequentially, so I can see the sort of parallels between the games, which is quite interesting to do as well. And I think one of the things to link us into Final Fantasy X, and this is something we discussed with Game Dove, is that some of the, I guess, structural story design stuff from 8 came back in 10 with the whole father-son stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think, I mean, obviously, I love Final Fantasy VIII with a passion, and I think Laguna's my man. But I think that 10 did that better, the whole father-son thing. And because you get it with Yuna's dad and Yuna as well. You get that kind of like generational hand the torch thing. Absolutely. I think it does it better than 8.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I just want to say you've mentioned your Game Dub episode, which I absolutely loved that. That was such a nice discussion, and I love anyone that loves Final Fantasy VIII. So great job with that.
Take over the world. Take over the world.
Yeah. It's part of the reason I want to discuss Final Fantasy X, along with the fact I've just finished it. But yeah, you did so well in that conversation. I was like, I can't live up to that. But no, and I think you're right. I think there's a lot of similarities between Final Fantasy VIII and Final Fantasy X, and a lot of the reasons I like both of them is very much to do with that sort of generational thing, because there's a lot of depth to them, and you could argue that Final Fantasy VII has that a bit, although I'd argue to a lesser degree. For example, we have the events with Zack Fair that happened in the past, very much informing the present with Cloud. We have some bits around Vincent Valentine and Lucrezia, which are sort of bits you can go and find in that game. And Professor Gast, we have his records in the Northern Continent, but they're nowhere near as substantial as Final Fantasy VIII and Final Fantasy X handle these past generations and how the past informs the current events and the characters that we're playing as. So same as you, I'd argue I think Laguna Loire is like he probably is my favourite Final Fantasy character. Certainly top 3.
He's close with me as well. He's my man. I feel like I'm him.
Yeah.
I thought it was very interesting. I mean, again, we're probably tangenting on to Final Fantasy VIII. Mol's going to tell us off in a second. But like, when I played Final Fantasy VIII, obviously Laguna's not the main character, but I remember thinking I identify more with this secondary character than I do with the main character. Obviously, I definitely identify with Squall as I got a bit older into my teen years. But I just remember thinking it's really interesting how this guy isn't actually the game's framed around him, but I kind of see myself more as him. I guess that's something Final Fantasy is quite good at doing, though, isn't it? The side characters tend to be your favourite.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't say I like him, but one of the most interesting characters in Final Fantasy for me is Cypher. Or Sephiroth. Like, he's fascinating, and I don't want to segue too far into Final Fantasy VIII. But you're right, these side characters, these peripheral characters that sort of build up the world and the backstories and things, like, they really are fascinating. Laguna's a great one. Also, it's interesting what you say about him not featuring so much, because, again, that's another similarity with, I suppose, Final Fantasy X, because we just have these fleeting flashbacks of Jecht and Braska and whatnot. But you may have seen this bounded about, but apparently like up to 50% of Final Fantasy VIII was cut down, and most of it was to do with Laguna. And there's been a lot of conversation around that in Final Fantasy communities. A lot of people would have wanted to see what that's like. For me, I really like the ambiguity of Final Fantasy VIII. So, for example, we're never outrightly told that Laguna is Squall's father. It's just like Kiros.
It's just something you have to infer from...
Kiros and a couple of others make some passing comments and stuff. But I love that. I love the ambiguity.
I feel like when it comes to the ambiguity as well, that's the kind of thing that I know for myself at the very least. I'm not going to speak for Jack, but that's the kind of thing that leads me to want to foster this kind of connection, to talk to other people. And, well, what did you interpret X, Y, or Z as? Or, how did you feel about the scene? Because everyone experiences it differently, which I think is just a fantastic thing in art in general anyway. But if I could go back a little further from Final Fantasy VIII, and I only bring this up because we recently discussed this, but Final Fantasy V also has a generational passing of the torch. I don't know if you've played 5 or know very much about that at all.
Yeah, I've played 5 about 10 years ago, so
yeah. Yeah, I know that was one of the things that Jack really praised about that game. That was something that really, really made you feel like this is a good game, the passing down of the generations. And it's interesting that I completely agree with what you said about 7. There is something of a generational moving on, I suppose, but in no way is it as over or as, I guess, dramatic as other games. I feel like 5 was the one that really started that, and then it was kind of absent all the way until 8 and Laguna and Squall, and then again it kind of becomes absent until 10 again. So I think it's really interesting there's a link between those games, even though at least in 5 it's very tenuous, shall we say?
I call them Kataseisms, right? But I think, and again, I'm very conscious that these are collective projects. I don't put too much stock into individual. I mean, I think some people treat people like Nomura or Katase or whatever as if they're like auteurs, as if they're like Hideo Kojima.
The Kojima effects,
and they're not. And actually, talking about my content, I have recently started doing staff bios on Square to sort of present what they contribute, where they're from, but also how they work in the collective, because these are collective games. But one thing I've noticed with Katase, and that's a great point about the generational divide, is he does tend to reuse themes in the games that he's more heavily involved in. I think he wrote a lot of the scenario in FF5. Also, FF8 is probably one of the games you could more so call his, because Sakaguchi was obviously off doing the film and everything. And he tends to introduce these sort of goofy duo characters, or like sort of comic reprieve characters, so we had Gilgamesh, then we had like Ultros, and then we have like Biggs and Wedge in FF8 and stuff. Like, so I call these Kataseisms. The Turks, exactly, yeah. We have these characters that are really, they're sort of like antagonists, but not necessarily antagonists. They have a lot of comedic appeal to them.
Team Rocket.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I feel like there are sort of threads that we could reasonably kind of pull out as Kataseisms, because they tend to feature more so in his games.
You can see that in the Ultimania. I got Volume 2 of the Ultimania, which talks about 7, 8, and 9.
Yeah.
And you can see the design notes for 7 where he talks about like the father passing the torch to the son, which I'll be mentioning in one of our videos actually. And I get the impression, because I think obviously Katase was massively involved in 8. I don't know how much he was involved with 9, but then he really came back for 10. And it feels like he's sort of like not quite done what he wanted to do with that passing the torch thing, and then really honed in on that on 10. It's interesting you saying about missing content from 8. When I was playing through 10, I remember thinking, hang on a minute, this thread they've got of climbing the mountain and finding all these notes basically in these spheres of what the people before have left behind felt very similar to what they think they were trying to do with the Timber Maniacs that Laguna had been writing and leaving around.
Yeah.
But that, I mean, to me, in a way, I prefer it because it is ambiguous and it sort of like makes more of a statement around the importance of journalism and writing and stuff like that, if you can interpret it that way. But 10's a lot more overt about it. So it feels to me like maybe Katase felt like he had one crack at the whip and thought, no, I've got to do this again. You could argue it's better in 10, but I don't know. That's open for debate, I guess.
The interesting thread from that, and I feel ironic that I'm saying the word thread there, is that, again, it's not like the entire Square Enix and Squaresoft team are just one conglomeration that, you push a button and a game comes out on the other end. It is multiple people working with different aspects of the game, and the end product is always going to be... There's always going to be similarities anyway, partially because it is an overall franchise rather than just, an individual whatever. But I've really felt this playing Final Fantasy XIV as well. It's really interesting to me when you can tell a particular member of staff has worked on a specific area of the game over others just by the things that they like to focus in on. And I've never really given Kitase and the handing down of the torch much thought before. I'm going to have to keep an eye out for that when I do playthroughs next, actually.
I suppose you mentioned there about you've done some content on the directors and staff members and stuff like that. It's stuff I'm probably going to dive into. I'm the same as you. I don't want to focus on one person being the sort of be-all and end-all, because a lot of the time, in anything, not just game design, like a lot of the time people get hero worshipped and put on a pedestal for stuff that
and others a completely shafted,
a group of people have done. So I try not to focus too much on that, but it's definitely interesting to sort of look at an era that's covered or associated with a person. So I probably will dive into some of your stuff on that. But I guess just to bring back to your content a little, have you got any like content creators that influenced you to do your own stuff, or was it an organic thing where you just, obviously you've been around 10 years or so, where you just decided to do your own stuff off your own back, or was there anyone you watched on YouTube that made you want to do stuff?
Good question. I started watching YouTube because I don't know if you remember, like old school YouTube, you could only upload videos that were like a max of 10 minutes.
That's right.
And then at some point it became like a couple of hours, and it's just increasingly got longer. But basically, when they stopped making it 10 minutes only, you started getting these long form content creators coming on that were doing retrospectives and reviews of Final Fantasy. And I'd be interested to know if you guys have noticed this, but basically at that time, so we're talking maybe 2012, 2013, a lot of people were just doing these retrospectives talking about how much they hated Final Fantasy VIII. And it really...
Jack has talked about that before,
It was just grinding my gears. I never had any ambitions to watch YouTube or whatever, but I was watching these long-form creators. Everyone was just dicking on Final Fantasy VIII, and I was like, I'm not having this. So I started YouTube kind of in response, basically, to other creators.
Oh, wow.
I don't necessarily need to... I won't name them and stuff, but it's like just old school creators that are still about, and they're huge, but like everyone was hating Final Fantasy VIII. So I suppose in terms of like inspiration and other people I was listening to back then, like Spoonie, a lot of people that have been around like forever, Kadikarus, Resonant Arc, I've always liked those guys actually, and they used to be called Dark Pixel.
That's right.
I think they've been around for a long time, and they're actually very kind to Final Fantasy VIII. So, but yeah, so those are the guys that I was sort of like listening to at the time, and then I started to do it just as a response to that. My first ever discussions were about Tekken. The reason being is it doesn't come naturally to me to sit and talk into a microphone in a room on my own. It feels really strange.
It's weird, isn't it?
Yeah. So I was like, I want to discuss Final Fantasy VIII. It's going to be like my magnum opus, but I need to grow accustomed to sort of this talking and recording audio and stuff. So I did a bunch of retrospectives on Tekken. For some reason, I've always loved the Tekken games. It's like Enter the Dragon meets Hamlet for me, it's just so, yeah, it's like, martial arts.
Who's your main?
My main is Paul Phoenix.
Horang for me, because the ginger hair.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, nice. Horang's wicked. Horang's wicked.
What I want to do one day is get in shape and then dress as Horang as a cosplay.
Oh, nice.
I'd pay good money to see that, actually.
Yeah, definitely,
But yeah, and some people find it weird. Sometimes I will still throw out an occasional Tekken episode, and people are like, it's like Final Fantasy, Tekken. They were like, what are you doing? But I'm very, I have a lot of love for Tekken. It's the first time I ever saw a 3D game The first time I ever saw a PlayStation 1, I went around my dad's friend's house, and he'd set it up because they were doing some DIY or something. They were like, just let the kids play on this. And it was like, up until then, I'd played on like a Sega Genesis, just playing Sonic the Hedgehog, these 2D games. And then it was like Tekken was the first game I ever saw. And I was like, fuck, this is amazing. But anyway, so sorry, taking the scenic route to my point, I ended up doing a Final Fantasy VIII retrospective. But now, like, as years are passing and stuff, there's new creators coming in to the scene. So for example, May Game Dove, who you've recently discussed, I'm just finding new creators all the time that are really sort of inspiring and I like listening to. So as I mentioned off camera, I recently started doing some collaborations. So I met the guys, Birds of Play, who are a couple of Icelandic YouTubers. So I've been on their channel discussing Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and they recently came on my channel in my first ever collab doing a tier list of Final Fantasy characters that we like. But yeah, so
how many disagreements were there?
There was a degree of harmony in the conversation.
A degree of that.
Yeah. There was some slight disagreements. But yeah, so that was an interesting one. And actually, Mol, I think I was listening to one of you, I can't remember what podcast it was, I was listening to one of you guys discuss, and you were talking about how the Final Fantasy community seems to have resurrected or come about and stuff. I think you were talking about Ben Starr specifically, and that is like an amazing byproduct of doing YouTube, because speaking about the Birds of Play guys, so Nukvi, they live in Iceland, and I actually went to Iceland last year and like met him. He took me around like downtown Reykjavik and we were just hanging out.
Wow.
I met him through YouTube, right? And if you told me when I started YouTube, years later, you're going to be sat in a bar in downtown Reykjavik, getting drunk and talking about Final Fantasy with an Icelandic dude, I'd be like, no way. But it's amazing. It's amazing how you sort of foster friendships and stuff through this.
I completely understand. I mean, one of my oldest friends at this point is someone who I didn't meet via YouTube, but I have known her for, I want to say probably about 12, 13 years at this point. She's American. And if you told me when I was in school, the hobby that you have that no one else knows about, that, is the really geeky thing, that's going to lead you worldwide, you're going to talk to people, you're going to have an amazing time, I would not have fucking believed it. I mean, if you told me this time last year, you'll be starting a YouTube channel and you'll be getting views in and you'll be talking to other content creators and just discussing Final Fantasy, I wouldn't have believed it. And then a month later, I would have met Jack all the same going to an event. So I think I don't even want to necessarily call it a rise or a resurrection in content creators, because it feels like at this point they've just always been there, especially on YouTube. But the fact that this franchise, which is over 30 years old, has still got its devoted fans who just want to discuss it. Doesn't matter if it's been talked about before. We've all got our own points that we want to throw into the ring, and we're all so open to discussing it.
Yeah.
And like you said, fosters community, which takes you worldwide, which introduces you to these incredible situations. It's so heartwarming to me, actually. I'm really proud to be a part of this community.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
Magical, isn't it? I've got to make a point and jump on and make a point. This is EXP Required History. Got onto an episode and I wasn't the first to mention Ben Starr.
Mark the fucking date down in the calendar.
So, to be slightly more seriously, to go onto that point, it's really interesting what you mentioned about Ben Starr and stuff like that, and kind of the thread we just talked about there around people talking more positively about Final Fantasy VIII, because you mentioned the Spoonie experiment, which I guess is okay to mention because I don't think he does content anymore.
Oh, okay.
But that was a big deal back in the day. The Spoonie experiment review, and I don't know how deep into the YouTube pit you went, but obviously the Angry Video Game Nerd, still a massive creator, but he was the first real person to do the game footage with a camera on his own, not as part of a studio from what I can tell, and he was massively influential, dunking on all these rightfully terrible games from the sort of NES era and stuff like that. And the kind of joke was kind of this communal thing of, we were all kids playing this crap that was shoveled out. Let's kind of dance all over that. I think when he came along, there became a lot of copycats. And it seemed to me like a lot of the time they just looked for things to dunk on, because it's very easy to dunk on stuff.
Yeah.
For me, it's not easy to sustain, because I did some content like that a few years ago. I thought I'll jump on this bandwagon probably very, very late and dunk on stuff that I like. But actually, it wasn't that fun, because I thought, actually, I don't dislike this. And there's parts I can riff on, but it's very hard to sustain when something I actually really love. Final Fantasy VIII, I made jokes about how did Zell and Selphie get onto the what was their, Squall had to go to the fire cavern. What did they have to do to get onto the mission? Yeah. And it was like, what did Selphie do? Maybe she took a selfie. What did Zell do? Maybe he took a Zelfie. Right. Really bad jokes like that. Right. So, and I was like, well, now I'm just scraping the barrel to take the piss out of this game, because actually I started thinking, I actually really like this.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, like, because I could, back to Final Fantasy VIII, as all roads lead to me with that game. I don't know when you first played it, Will, but when I first played it, the magazines were going on about how it was the best thing ever. Graphically, it was better than 7, and it was the future, and look how brilliant it looks. It's amazing. We've got this film coming out. It looks more like Final Fantasy VIII than it does look like Final Fantasy VII. And it was critically, revered. There was a few comments about the system not being the same as 7, but it wasn't until those creators came along later and started dunking on it that the tune seemed to change around it. As like, and then it got reinvented as we've always all hated this game, which I think is really, I don't know if that's your perspective.
It's very interesting because, and again, this ties into sort of the community and I suppose, like how you sort of like think about games in general. But I was always just excited for a Final Fantasy to come out. And even now, there's still a lot of negativity. Like some people perceive Final Fantasies have grown worse over time. And I suppose, it's subjective. It depends what sort of game. Some people like the Evilise games, some people don't. Some people like action-oriented games, some people don't. But yeah, I've never really harboured any sort of negativity towards it. And I was always just excited to meet someone else that liked Final Fantasy and any kind of game that came along. I was really excited about it. But yeah, it does seem at some point, you rightly suggested, maybe it did coincide with the rise of YouTube. It's just this sort of negativity came about that just seemed prolific. As I say, when I started watching YouTube, it was just everywhere. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it actually did inform some. Like, I do have some principles about how I approach YouTube. Not being negative is one of them. I try and discuss it, even things that I don't necessarily like. I'll sort of pose it as a question, weigh up pros and cons about it, rather than like dicking on everything. It just felt like putting negative energy into the world, and I just don't like that sort of thing.
Yeah,
I don't know where it comes from. And then, on the community side, it was like you have this sort of gatekeeperishness that emerged from nowhere, and I was just like, when I was a teenager, even now, if I find someone that's into Final Fantasy, like they're immediately like my best friend. I don't know why.
Because it's a bond stronger than anything else on Earth, clearly.
Yeah.
No one understands us, as my friend once said. I really like that you've said that you kind of created content to react to that kind of stuff, because at some point we'll probably do some kind of roundtable with like everyone that's Final Fantasy VIII fans to talk about why we think it's been changed in the zeitgeist at some point. I want to do that at some point. But to me, if you look at PlayStation Access, Rob, and Holly used to be on PlayStation Access. Holly specifically is a massive Final Fantasy VIII fan. When I was watching their video content back in, say, 2015, 2016, when they first sort of started getting traction, they were talking about Final Fantasy VIII in a positive light. There was no reference to, we know it's bad, blah, blah, none of that stuff. It was just like, Final Fantasy VIII's really good, and remember when this happened. And I remember thinking, whoa, I think this is very, very different than what I've experienced. And because I know that certainly Rob on PlayStation Access has a magazine background, it could very well be, without putting words in his mouth because I don't know, that he had more of a reading through magazines how good Final Fantasy VIII was, as opposed to listening on YouTube as to how people perceived Final Fantasy VIII. It's quite an interesting, and I think jumping on Mol's point there of the thread maybe having already been there, and it feels like there's been lots of dormant people that have sat there going, hang on a minute, we don't dislike Final Fantasy VIII. What was everyone jumping on? And now they just have come out of the woodwork, and it's hopefully we can get to a point where we reinvent history back to the way it was.
Yeah.
Which is very Final Fantasy VIII, isn't it?
Yeah, it's true. It's true.
So going off of your overview of like how YouTube has changed and the content creators that have been around and stuff, what other kinds of things have you noticed like have changed with the platform, if anything? I mean, obviously people are going to talk about different things in different ways and manners the more that time goes on, but is the sphere the same way that it was 10 years ago, or has it changed drastically in your opinion?
I don't know how much of this is actually probably I think the algorithm has become much more focused and granular, so it knows like what sort of thing I like. So it feels like a lot of that negativity, sort of like shock value content has diminished, but it may be the algorithm is just feeding me stuff that is relevant to, like all I get is Final Fantasy VIII essays. So I feel like people have become much more, again, the stuff I'm getting fed, the stuff I'm looking at, people have become much more measured and sort of academic in their approach. There's a lot more considered granular focus on specific aspects of games rather than just these big sort of cohesive retrospectives and stuff, which very much used to be the vogue. So yeah, it has changed quite a bit, I think, for the better. But again, maybe it's just what the algorithm is giving me.
Hey, if the algorithm's feeding you good things, don't complain.
Yeah.
They'll take it away.
Yeah. So no, yeah, it's an interesting space. And I think actually, again, going back to your game dev episode, I think one of you guys mentioned it. It was like there's just always room for everybody to contribute. And, there has been the proliferation of content creators. Again, like as I say, I've been around sort of like 10 years. So I've seen just exponential growth in the amount of content creators. But there is room for everybody. And there's a lot of like new opinions and fresh perspectives coming in. And it's really good to see.
There's something about journalism to comment on, I guess, with YouTube, because you mentioned there around, and these are my words. You mentioned there around, YouTube being a place back in the day for people to dunk on stuff and have a pop at things and find sort of fault in things, and especially around Final Fantasy VIII. But actually, like the way that YouTube is now, where you describe there with the video content getting longer, it enabled people to write long form essays and discuss them. So it created a bit more, I guess, I don't know if journalistic integrity is the right phrase, but it enables people to sort of, in a way, create more quality content and actually talk about things that they really, really like.
Yeah.
So it makes it less about let's jump on a trend and shit all over Final Fantasy VIII and stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
And actually have some... So actually, in a way, YouTube's grown up in some respects.
Yeah.
I never thought I'd hear those words.
Some respects, yeah.
I think one sort of relatively recent change and a counterpoint I'd make to that is the rise of AI. And so I was talking to, again, it was before I recorded with the Birds of Play guys, the Icelanders. We were chatting about it, and they were talking about how they were getting fed AI content. And it's not something I'd really, like, people I work with and stuff, they use ChatGPT to help them write copy and stuff. Almost always needs tailoring. Like, I've dicked about with ChatGPT, and I don't rate it particularly much. So the rise of AI, which is interesting because I hadn't really encountered it, I hadn't really dealt with it, but apparently a lot of content is just coming out that is like, if not AI recorded, then it's AI written sort of thing. And recently I tried doing something new. I tried a little, because most of my content is sort of like conversations, debates, looking at particular features or characters or whatever. I'd done a wholly descriptive one because... Again, love Final Fantasy VIII, and I just discussed each location in the world of Final Fantasy VIII. So it was a very descriptive episode. And then, like, one of the first comments I got on that was like, "Dude, you don't need to like lower yourself to doing AI scripts." And I was just like, "What the hell?" I was like, "What?" And apparently, yeah. So that's when I realised I was like, apparently this is a thing that people are doing." Fortunately, and as people replied to him rightly, there was so much subjectivity, even though I was doing a descriptive talk through of the locations, there was so much subjectivity and of my own opinion injected into it. It's like, obviously not AI, but that's a real concern.
Yeah.
But I think people are quite discerning as an audience, and I think most people can sort of tell the difference and see when someone's producing quality and not something that's just crap that's written by ChatGPT. Because I think, my understanding of ChatGPT, all it can really do is scrape the internet for stuff that already exists. So, it's so vague, you're not really going to get anything good out of it. And I think the amount of time that you would have to spend trying to refine those questions or whatever you're asking it, it's like...
You might as well just spend the effort doing it yourself.
And for me, to be completely honest with you, I love the written word. And if this was like, if I'd started in a pre-YouTube, but obviously in a pre-YouTube era, I'd be much more amenable to writing like blogs and stuff.
Yeah.
I just felt like... So for me, it's like script writing is like the fun part. Recording it and putting video to it is sort of just like the necessary evil that I have to do to get it out into the world.
I mean, Jack and I were discussing this offline a couple of days ago as well. It was along the lines of sometimes the act of creating can be really, really fucking difficult and a pain in the arse, and I hate doing every second of it, but like the end product is what makes it worth it. I know there's a fantastic quote out there from Kevin Perjurer, the guy who runs Defunctland, which essentially sums up to... I hate every moment of making the videos that I make, but I hate every moment that I'm not making videos even more, which kind of really sums up how I feel about writing as well. I mean, I'm the one that does all of our written editing, if not the writing behind it. I've always written. I've never written in a massively professional capacity. I would like to potentially one day, especially now that we've experimented with a different way of doing videos and a different style as well, and having that really appeal. The fun part is the creation and, the research and having an end product. I don't understand the people that would prefer to use ChatGPT or any other generative process. It's just generating the words that it thinks is correct. It's not doing any work. It's not putting critical thought into it. And I mean, ultimately my feelings and thoughts on AI boil down to, if you didn't create it, why should I consume it?
Yeah.
And also, why are the robots taking all the fun things away from us?
That's true. And I think the people that use that are... there's sort of two ways that you could like look at content creation in YouTube and stuff. Some people perceive it as a way to make a quick buck, and the amount of people I know, like my friends or friends of friends and stuff, that like it's come up that I do YouTube, and they're like, oh yeah, I'm going to do YouTube, and they see it as a avenue to wealth and glory and not having to work 9 to 5, which it's not. It's a ball ache, and
the opposite.
It's really hard work. Yeah,
and And then there's the people that do it, as a hobby because they love it and stuff, which is very much the perspective I take. As I say, I started it as a response to Final Fantasy VIII. The reason I was so hit and miss with it, like sometimes I wouldn't upload anything for like 6 months plus, because again, talking about principles, like one of my principles is that I don't want to put negativity out there. A second one is I never want it to feel like work, because I already have a job, and I'm not going to force it. I do it because I enjoy it. And if I don't feel like I have anything to say, then I'm not going to say anything. I'm just in a fortunate position at the moment. I've never been in this position before, but I got really ill with COVID last year, and I was out for like a month, and I was just feeling really inspired, and I managed to get like loads of scripts out. So I'm actually like 10 weeks ahead. I've got weekly episodes scheduled in like 10 weeks ahead. I've never been this far in advance with content before, so I'm being pretty consistent, and it gives me time to think
to
about
come up
myself.
with the next thing.
Yeah. But again, as I say, so I'm lucky I've had a creative spurt recently, but I'm never going to force it. And
I'm really jealous because I got ill before Christmas, and all it did was make me want to sleep.
Yeah. On that note, one of the best video essays I've ever heard, ever watched. And I respect this guy because he did it, and then he was just like, I don't feel inspired anymore. I think his YouTube channel was Will Talks Video Games or Will Loves Video Games. And he'd done a 5-hour retrospective on The Elder Scrolls Oblivion. And it's fucking brilliant. It's so good. And then he'd done one video after that, realised basically, I don't have the passion for this. And I think he left a comment or something in the description. He was basically like, because the Elder Scrolls one, it's got millions of views. And he was like, basically, I just really wanted to talk about Oblivion. And he was like, I feel like I'm forcing it now. I don't have anything else to say. So he just stopped doing YouTube. And I was just like, yeah, respect.
Yeah, Jesus, that's integrity you don't see often.
Integrity, yeah, definitely. And I mean, I think, I'm one of these people that I don't do things unless I think I can sustain them. Because I wouldn't want to become successful and then be like the person that everyone jumps on. I mean, like the guy that made Flappy Bird, for example. Like I've always been hesitant to start something off unless I know that there's loads in the tank, which is why I think Final Fantasy ended up being. I mean, there are some games as well. I mean, Tekken's interesting is one that I love as well. And there are a lot of games I could just keep talking about forever. And I don't think that the fuel's ever going to run out, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And I think the beauty of Final Fantasy is that we can tangent around quite a lot. And if you're bored of one at the moment, I mean, like I've just done Final Fantasy VIII pretty much through and caught lots of footage and stuff like that. And I'm like, I'm not really in the mood to play it again. But I'm happy to jump on another one. There's something about it that's easy to talk about the same thing, but vary up quite a lot. So it's difficult to, certainly for me, to feel burnt out with this stuff because there's always going to be something else. And if say, for example, I got burnt out talking about the mainline series, then I'm no more would bully me into playing 14, and that would get me inspired again, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Or you'd hate me forever.
That's part of the course. So we've mentioned your delivery styles and stuff and how you're like writing. And interestingly, like Mol alluded to it there, more of a writer than I am. I'm more of an editor, so I kind of like I really enjoy that part of it. I know that makes me weird, but I've since I was a kid, I used to do Lego movies back in like 2002, 2003, and I remember like really resonating with editing and making the illusion of the film, and so I like that bit a bit more. So yeah, I guess that's where our
strengths
our magic comes from, well, wasn't it? But it's interesting you said there about writing. Is like what I really like about your content is how you seem to strike a really interesting balance of the way you deliver stuff.
Yeah,
you've got like a very relaxed speaking tone when you do it, but you've also quite clearly researched it, and you must have, unless you've got an amazing memory, you must have like a script of some form. So what's your secret? Because it doesn't seem at any point like you're sort of reading off a script when I listen to your stuff. I mean, there's a little bit of, and I mean this in a nice way, university lecture stuff going on there.
Yeah.
But I don't know, what's your secret?
It's strange talking about how I started the channel. It did coincide with something else that was happening, which I was doing a master's degree in the history of art. I really wanted to write my thesis on video games, and because I went to quite a lofty, pretentious university, they were like, that is not going to happen. They were like, it's mainly because at the time there was no professors to sort of be able to peer review it and respect it, because there's not many people in the field. And a lot of the people that have written on video at that time that had written on video games in an academic capacity was like, is it destroying the minds of our children? You know, that was the level of the debate. Actually, again, sorry, just speaking about Birds of Prey, Nokvi is actually an academic. I know he does a lot on JRPGs. So the field has evolved since then.
Thank God.
So exciting, isn't it?
Yeah.
If you don't mind me asking, when did you graduate?
2014.
Okay.
From a master's, yeah. But I did do it later. I don't know if you were trying to date me there, but I did do my master's a bit later than I should have. But yeah, so I always had a view to go into academia, and then realised that it's a very publish or perish combative environment, and I was just like, I just do not have the energy for that. I didn't particularly want to do a PhD either. So yeah, I kind of fumbled my way and ended up in advertising and then the tech space. So as I say, I'm a sort of UX UI designer. Yeah, that was a weird thing. But anyways, to go back to your question about structuring scripts and debates and conversations and that sort of thing. I do have an academic background. I like constructing arguments in that academic way. When I started, I did used to just freestyle it, and the editing, because I've actually got a Google Doc in front of me right now, just with some notes for you, and across the top it says in big bold letters, please be concise, because I have a real issue with just talking shit and just going off on tangents. And it was really...
That's what we're about. That's what we're about. That's literally...
You just described every single day of my life.
Yeah. So I did have to refine it a lot in the editing process. So what I started doing was taking notes, just the beats of the argument, the beats of the conversation, and working to that. And then that sort of just evolved more into like paragraphs and then sort of full scripts. So it depends on the nature of the conversation. If it's something I'm really kind of confident in, like Final Fantasy VIII, generally I'll just write loose notes about what I'm going to talk through, and then I'll do it. But yeah. Does that answer your question a little bit?
Yeah, no, it does. It's just really interesting. You're quite unique from what I can see in the YouTube space, because obviously you're talking to us here, there's a bit more backwards and forwards where on that conversation there, it does feel a little bit like a university lecturer, but it's not dull, if that makes sense. It's not like I'm sort of like going, it's interesting how you seem to get quite a bit of momentum with what you do. I don't know. It's just unique. Yeah, I like it.
It feels quite conversational, at least from my point of view.
Yeah, I think that's probably a better way of putting it. Yeah, it feels conversational, but one-sided, which is really like, okay.
I do call them discussions as well, because as the audience has grown and I get comments, people make really good points. And again, going back to the thing about not putting negative energy out there and stuff, I feel like a lot of what you put out is what you get back. So if I'm having a measured conversation about a game or a mechanic or a character, like I'd say maybe the majority of what I get back is a measured response to that. And their own thoughts and stuff. So I do call them discussions. And actually, sometimes I make follow-up videos based on some of the really good feedback I've had. So I do try and structure them like that. And then I suppose as well, I create the sort of content that I personally want to see. So I used to have like a little intro bit of music and stuff like that. Like personally, when I watch YouTube, I don't really like intros, particularly ones that are over like 15 seconds, because I just want to get to the heart of the subject.
Just get into it, yeah.
Yeah, so I do that. I've actually stripped everything back, and it just opens with the opening volley of the debate or whatever I'm talking about. And actually, literally yesterday, I received a comment. My most recent episode is discussing the sphere grid and how we rate that as like a leveling system. And one of the comments on that was like, I just really appreciate how you just have a cold open, you go straight into it. There's no fluff. So yeah, and again, that's something that I've had to nurture and evolve. But that is how I try.
I know from my time in university, I really, really appreciate the way that your videos are structured in an essay manner. Like, here is your introduction, here is the meat of your essay, and here is your conclusion. Like, it's fucking perfect. It's wonderful.
Thank you. That's humbling.
No, it's not. I actually I'll jump on that as well. I partly just to listen to, and partly around the time I asked you to come on to the podcast, I have this thing where I'll go to the gym, I'll power walk. And I'll put my phone on. I'll just listen to stuff. I actually listened to quite a bit of your stuff at the gym. So I remember listening to, I think it was I think it might be the Sifa, deep dive into Sifa's character. I think you started talking about philosophers and stuff like that. And I was like, well, this is interesting. And I was like walking along thinking, oh, actually, there's a bit more to this. There's a bit more like, you've clearly got a bit of knowledge of sort of specific philosophy points and things like that. And I think that's really important as well, to going back to the point about YouTube and I guess games journalism growing up in a sense. I think it's really good to, as an antidote to what you just said about there having universities that kind of frown upon the medium. I think what you're doing, and hopefully what we're doing as well, and a lot of other people are doing, is pushing against that. Eventually that will go away and it will just be discussed as any form of other art medium.
Yeah,
well, so I think it's exciting. He's hoping anyway.
I'm thinking that's exciting though, isn't it?
Actually, piggybacking off of the whole idea of YouTube having matured, one of the things that I noticed in the videos that I watched of yours as well, you do bring up like real life comparisons, which I love in video essays, especially when it's to do with games, because there is no escaping real world inspirations and motivations and stuff like that. But the one that really jumped out to me was when in one of your Final Fantasy X videos, you actually started discussing very, very loosely, and I don't blame you at all because it's a very deep topic with, understanding of it can be very skewed as well. But it was speaking about Buddhism in the sense of greed grief and suffering and escaping that, especially in regards with Tidus and Yuna. And this is something that I adored anyway, and that really made me like sit up and like, actually, yeah, this guy really knows what he's talking about, and I want to listen to this, and I want to explore this further and do, go away and do my own research. In a non-Final Fantasy arena, one of the channels that I watch semi-regularly, or at least when they put out videos, is the Tarnished Archaeologist. They do a lot of deep dives into Elden Ring, and at first it was like, well, I just kind of want to understand the story a little bit more, without having to rely on one of the big three YouTubers in the Elden Ring sphere. But what really drew me into Tarnished Archaeologist's videos was the fact that every single video starts with some kind of real-world inspiration or historical fact or mythological legend, and this is how it influenced the game, and this is what we can draw from the game looking at real-world inspirations. And I would really, really love to see more of that in the Final Fantasy sphere anyway, but also do for myself. I think it's very, very underrated how much inspiration and unconscious things that we pick out of real world to put into video games. I mean, it's as Jack said, they are a valid piece of art, and we should look at it the same way that any other piece of art is, like drawn work or literature. So yeah.
I mean, the real part of the reason I love the Evilise games so much is how you can look at them with sort of like real world perspectives and structures and things. So when I've discussed Final Fantasy XII, I've tended to discuss it in the view of like free will. Actually, Vayne, I feel bad for Vayne because he's never discussed as like a top 5 villain and stuff, but he is so cool. He's so interesting.
He's brilliant. I honestly don't even want to call him a villain.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and there is an argument where you could say, well, is he just pursuing free will? There's ways to look at that game, but it's the political makeup of the Evilise games, the structures of it, and tactics. I did a tactics retrospective. Literally, it was just an excuse to talk about the Wars of the Roses and how tactics is an allegory for that. I'm quite a class conscious person, and there's a lot of like social class elements in tactics as well. That game is fucking brilliant, and the story
correct.
The story of tactics is in my top 3 for sure. Like delete
and that's the reason you're on.
Well, I mean, I've not finished tactics, but we did a tactics episode, so I did watch the game through kind of thing. I found it really, really hard. But good hard. I wanted to sit and actually play it a bit more. I think for me, Ramza is one of the top protagonists of Final Fantasy.
I genuinely thought you were going to say villain for a second there. I was like, hang
on, what a protagonist. What a brilliant character, sort of.
It's great. There's a dynamic between Ramza and Delita, which I won't go into if you haven't completed it, but it's really good. But it's an interesting point you make as well, because I think there's a misconception and a disconnect between loving these games, loving Final Fantasy games, and then also being good at games, because I'm not that good at video games.
All that I just said about Elden Ring, I've been getting my best friend to drag me through them with a co-op mod. I cannot fucking play Souls-likes for the life of me, but my god, the story's interesting.
Yeah, I beat Ornstein and Smo on Dark Souls 1, and I think I was like, that's enough for me because it's hard.
Yeah, you've just reminded me of another YouTuber that I've been watching for a long time who tends to do more streams and stuff, but he's called like Dan's Gate.
Dan's Go 8, is it?
Yeah, I don't know how you... I'm never sure how you mean. But I only realised like this year, because I think he'd done a video talking about it, but that stands for Dark Anima No Sphere Grid 2008, because he does all these insane challenges, and he actually, this is back in the Game Facts and stuff, like I love those websites. Back in the day, people were saying it couldn't be done, you couldn't defeat Anima with no sphere grid, and he did it. And his very first video on YouTube, you can go back and look at it, he's literally just recording his old TV set like with a phone showing him defeating Anima.
That makes me feel better, because every time I think that I'm insane for thinking about these games too much, other people do stuff like that, and I'm like, oh, I'm the normal one.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's insane about the amount of challenge run stuff. I mean, we've mentioned Mutski on this channel before about how Mutski got his start he's a speedrunner, but predominantly a Final Fantasy IX speedrunner. And he got his start, for want of a better term, doing... What got him into speedrunning was that he wanted to get the Excalibur 2 in Final Fantasy IX, and then he realised, hang on a minute, like I can actually just keep doing this. And over the time, if you get more people running a game, you learn more and more about the mechanics, and it becomes this interesting kind of world. And it's fascinating that like the challenge run side of stuff. I mean, we'll go on to 10 in a bit more detail in a bit, but I recently watched, it's the one where they start singing the... it's the relay from RPG Limit Break in I think 2019 one, where all the runners are on there, and they go through, and of course, because Final Fantasy X is a cutscene heavy game, and you can't skip the cutscenes, the speedruns particularly long, but the benefit of that is it gives them a lot of downtime to talk about the lore of the game and how the game mechanics work. And what they do during that, in the big long sections that you just keep smashing X, is they like interview the people, part of the relay team doing the thing. Fascinating video.
Wow.
Especially when it gets to the bit in the lake when they all sing the song.
You sent me
really
that
worth
video
watching.
offline, and that honestly made my evening.
Yeah, and I actually totally. I mean, there's another one they did of Final Fantasy VIII where I think it was a relay. I think it was just before COVID. I think that one was European speedrunners or something like that. But basically, they were relaying Final Fantasy VIII, and they were each doing certain parts of the game, and they got to the Eyes on Me segment, and they all sung Eyes on Me. It's quite heartwarming that you've got these guys that are all singing this song that they've heard 25 years ago, that they probably experienced on their own in their rooms. They all met up however many years later, and they all know the words to it. I think there's some magic in that, really, I think.
Community!
Oh, it's wonderful. So we'll take a break and be back in a minute. Okay, so we're back after that break. How's it going, everyone? Feeling good?
Not too bad, actually. I'm ready to get stuck into the meat of FF10, if you guys are.
Yes, this is where we really nail down onto FF10. Okay, so I guess the first question for you Will, would be, what is it about FF10 that you like? And actually, I think, when did you first play it? Was this like one of your early Final Fantasies? Or
Yeah,
whatever,
I think I've played most of them at release. Well, since Final Fantasy IX at least, I've played them at release. The only exception to that being Final Fantasy XIII. And I think, Jack, I've heard you say before, and I'm very much the same, I bought a PlayStation 5 because Final Fantasy XVI was coming out. So each subsequent console generation I've bought for the Final Fantasy, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I did play Final Fantasy X at release. And I think part of the reason I want to discuss it and why it's so interesting to me is it was such a radical departure from what had come before, particularly if you're like me and you were introduced to the series with Final Fantasy VII. I think you sort of grew accustomed to what you thought the series was, which is like, world map screen, field screen, battle screen, pre-rendered backgrounds, dialogue boxes, and whatnot. And then Final Fantasy X was a complete departure from that. And what's interesting is, so it wasn't my favourite at release. And I was like, oh, I'm not sure where they're going with this. But then over time, it's grown to become one of my favourite games. So that's why it's so interesting to me, because I've had such a turnaround on it, I suppose.
It's a slow burn. Oran! So the voice acting probably put you off now. That's interesting, because I obviously I was just offline just for the listeners' benefit. Originally, we were going to talk about Final Fantasy VIII, which we technically did quite a bit. And I think you messaged me earlier saying, no, can we talk about 10 instead? And that was really fortuitous, because I've just rolled credits on 10 for the first time. And I pretty much an hour before you sent me that message, I'd just done that. And I was like, this is brilliant. For me, it was similar-ish. I didn't get a PlayStation 2 till later. I've told this story before about me crying in Asda because Final Fantasy X was coming to PlayStation 2 and I didn't have it.
It's always the detail about Asda that gets
Yeah, it was Asda because I remember seeing I think it might be PSM2 or it might be the official PlayStation magazine of Lulu on the front cover, and it said Final Fantasy X PS2, and I was heartbroken because that Christmas I wanted a Game Boy Advance, and that was more of a priority than the PS2. So I didn't get 10 for a while, and it became a bit of this sort of sought after thing. But when I eventually did play it, again rolling credits on it recently, I kind of looked at it as this very, very unique artifact, because it is like nothing that came before it, but it's also like nothing that's happened afterwards.
Yeah.
It's like this weird middle ground in a sense. In a way, because of the fact it goes back to turn-based battling as opposed to ATB. It's kind of like the rightful sequel to Final Fantasy III in a way, because ATB was really introduced in Final Fantasy IV. And then obviously with 12, it goes into more of a sort of MMO and style combination between real-time and turn-based combat, whereas 10's very much a turn-based game. Obviously you can tweak that. It's an interesting artifact anyway, I definitely have.
Yeah, I'm in complete agreement with you. As I said, I've recently done an episode on the sphere grid, and actually as I was kind of playing back through the game, researching it and stuff, I'm like, yeah, the sphere grid is such a strange anomaly that they've never sort of went to since, because, I feel like Square have always sort of been torn between adhering to these traditions and conventions of JRPG, which is having job class-based characters and stuff, and then trying to depart from that or experiment with that. And yeah, so the sphere grid is one such example. And as you say, the sort of, I think they called it the conditional turn-based system instead of the ATB, which is interesting. It's interesting as well because I love Hiroyuki Ito is my idol, and he designed the junction system and the materia system and directed Final Fantasy IX and VI alongside Kitase. And I love the way he designed systems. But actually, Final Fantasy X was done by someone else whose name has just jumped out of my head, which is annoying. But yeah, so it's a completely different animal. We were talking about kind of different personnel that work on the Final Fantasy games. And yeah, so Ito didn't actually touch this one at all. I really liked it though. I'm not sure how you felt about it, but the ability to sort of switch out characters and that sort of thing on the battle screen, I really quite like that.
took a while to get used to, because I mean, obviously, like with a lot of the say the golden era, well, I suppose anything from 4 onwards, if you're in a battle and you just can't be arsed with it, you can just hit spam attack and get through it. Whereas 10 doesn't really let you do that until later on, because it builds around having to swap to the different classes. So initially, when I first got access to, I think, all of the characters apart from Riku, because you get her a little bit later, I remember like struggling a little bit at first because I was like, why am I dying constantly? And actually, it turns out you need to swap to Lulu, your black mage, and then take her out of the party and then bring Waka in or whoever to hit the flying enemies. And I think eventually when I got into the rhythm of it and understanding that you're supposed to use all the characters, I really vibe with it, but it did take a while.
Yeah,
so.
And that's exactly it. And this is where it was such a foreign concept if you'd sort of been introduced to the games with Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy VIII, because actually character classes don't really exist in those games. I mean, you can wholesale change the materia setup. You can just change them between characters, like the junction system. You can just change the GFs between characters. So there was nothing inherently unique to a given character, and actually you could bring the character along for the story rather than picking them based on a character class like you had to do in Final Fantasy IX, for example. So yeah, to your point, if you've got a load of elementals in a battle, you need to bring in Lulu, particularly at the beginning of the game. Otherwise, you've just got a real uphill battle on your hands.
Going back to what you said earlier about FF8's tutorial being kind of a bit of a slog to get through as well. So Final Fantasy X is not my favourite Final Fantasy. I don't even think it's really in my top 5. I've already forgotten what we did for our end of year list. That's not very good, is it?
I think you had it at number 6. If I remember
right, okay. Oh, yeah, wow, that does sound like me. Yeah. But it's one of those things of, like, I very much appreciate and can see exactly where they were going with a lot of the game systems, and I do recall the tutorial systems at the very beginning of the game and, you know, introducing you to the battle system and how it's different this time. I didn't have any problem with that whatsoever. I think later on in the game, like Jack said, it's not too much of an issue because you're at that point, you are strong, you've got all the shit you need, you can just, you know, you can decimate villages if you so wish. But early on, if you don't care for a character and you have to swap out for them, I remember that pissing me off quite a bit the first time I played. Now I can appreciate that a lot more. I don't know about you, I struggle with whether or not I think job-based or like everyone can do everything is a better system, but I appreciate that 10 kind of marries the two together and that everyone is very much locked to their role, but then with the sphere grid you can overcome that, and then also because you can swap out whenever you want in battle, there isn't really that much of an issue. It's just a case of I don't want to play as Auron or Waka or whatever, you know, that, and that's my issue. Why don't you want to play
as Auron? Oh my god, Auron's the man!
But why would I want to play as Auron when I could play as Lulu? Come on, man.
No.
That's true. But I think Final Fantasy X, it does circumvent that bringing the character rather than the class thing, because basically everyone is together. And I suppose actually this is probably one of the negatives I had to the game originally. One of the things I loved about Final Fantasy games is where you kind of split out on your adventure. So Final Fantasy VIII, again, just as a classic example, but it's like, you know, you split the team. Like some of you go to Balam and then some of you go to the Galbadia missile base and stuff like that. Final Fantasy VII did it, Final Fantasy IX did it really well as well, where you kind of break off with Steiner, who's kidnapping Princess Garnet or trying to take her back or whatever. I love those because it allowed each character to sort of develop in their own way separately. Whereas in Final Fantasy X, you're all along for the adventure. So where in Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy VIII, I'd be torn about how to build my party because I'm like, oh, am I going to get more interesting dialogue options with Vincent over Tifa or you know, whatever. You don't really have that in Final Fantasy X because everyone's along for the ride.
Which is really interesting from a narrative perspective as well, because normally you need that break, you need that schism between characters and like party members and stuff in anything really to create some kind of tension. And the fact that 10 actually manages to keep the party together for pretty much all of the game, I think the only real bit that jumps out to me is when Eunice separated from the rest of them in Bevelle, and even that's very, very temporary. There's no real conflict between the party in a game where you would expect there to be conflict. And it's done really, really well. All the conflict is external and pressing in on the party, which only reinforces them to become, well, more clicked together, I suppose.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. You know, most of the obstacles are extrinsic, and yeah, I think you do have some subtleties. So, for example, you have Waka's xenophobia and stuff, and you have, I mean, the big pivot is when Tidus learns that the summoner is not going to survive this pilgrimage and stuff. So you know, you have all of that sort of thing. But I think those extrinsic things were so interesting that you didn't need internal conflict in the party. I don't know if I mentioned earlier, but one of the reasons I really like Final Fantasy X is it has a lot of similarities to Final Fantasy VIII. So we've talked about the generational divide, but there's also these really interesting hooks that just keeps you playing. So, for example, one of the most amazing moments I had when I first played through Final Fantasy VIII was when they all collapse on the train to Timber, and you have the Laguna dream. And as a little kid, I was just like, am I playing this game wrong? Like, what the hell is happening? And then they wake up and they realise they've all had the same dream.
Yeah.
And I had this chill went down my spine. I was like, what the fuck is going on? And that really pushed me to want to know. And I just flew through that game because I was like, I need to get to the bottom of this mystery. In a not dissimilar fashion, in Final Fantasy X, you have Tidus talking about Jecht and knowing Auron in the Zanarkand at the beginning of the game. And then you get to Spira, and everyone knows Auron and everyone knows Jecht, but they have a completely different perspective on him. They're like, oh yeah, Sir Jecht, he's a really nice guy. And it's just like, what's going on here? Like, so yeah, you didn't need the inner conflict with the party because there were so many compelling things outside of that to make you keep going.
What I like about it is obviously I'm going to pronounce it wrong, is the Isekai thing, isn't it? Where it's that the Wizard of Oz type, you're whisked away into a different world. And I think what's really good about it is that you are Tidus, whatever you want to call him. Yeah. You are him. You are seeing things from his perspective. I mean, I made a joke, I think, in one of our early episodes about you could just blame everything on Sin's toxin if you don't remember stuff. But that's a really good mechanic because it doesn't create any conflict with the characters that they're in a different world. He can just say, oh, it's Sin's toxin, and he can get away with not knowing stuff.
Yeah.
And it's a really good sort of storytelling device where, you know, you're Tidus, you're him, and you're sort of experiencing this world as you go. And because of that, there's a lot of mystery that you, like you said there, with what the fuck's going on with the Timber mission. There's lots of things that Auron throws out there. You're like, what's going on? What's Auron's real vibe? You know, I'm jumping on what you just said there. Tidus sees them one way and the other world sees them another way. What the game's really good at doing is letting you know very early on, maybe not explicitly, but somewhere in the middle is going to be the truth.
Yeah.
And I think that's really good because we talked about no conflict, but in a sense, it's the conflict of what Tidus' perspective and then what Yuna's party's perspective are and things, and how they kind of like act as a bit of a tug of war between each other and sort of balance out in the middle. I think it's wonderful.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Yeah. And I think there's a narrative device. You know, there's this concept of the unreliable narrator.
Yeah. Yes.
And as far as I know, I think Tidus is the first character we ever have that is like a narrator of the game, I think. Yeah. So it was unique in that respect. But then as we play through, it's just like, well, is Tidus just really biased against his dad? Because, you know, Yuna has this completely different angle on him and stuff. And it's this compelling thing. It's like, again, like Final Fantasy VIII, we're shown a certain amount of Jecht, we're shown a certain amount of Laguna, but it's actually what's not shown that is really, which in a way, the most compelling thing. It's just like, what was Jecht like? And I've got an episode where I discussed Jecht that's quite old now, but I was talking about this stuff. I was just like, well, who's correct? Is it Tidus or is it Yuna? Is it somewhere in the middle? Because what we learn from Jecht is he's not necessarily like a good guy at all. He's not like Laguna, who's just an absent father. He's like an absent father, but also kind of an asshole as well.
Yeah.
And for me, that was something really refreshing about Final Fantasy X, actually. It made it really difficult to get through parts of the game at times. But the fact that this is the first Final Fantasy game that really deals with the issue of familial abuse as well, and generational abuse. I know one person who is a massive Final Fantasy X fan, like it is his top game of all time, and he's told me previously that, you know, he thinks the main theme of 10 is the breaking of the cycles of violence, which I can't really disagree with too much. One of the things that I remember he really, really noted one time when we were talking about it was the fact that Tidus is the person that's willing to challenge all the norms of Spira and not necessarily, you know, the abuse that he suffered at the hands of Jecht, or the abuse of being a dream of the faith and now suddenly being put into this world. That's less of an issue than the tackling of Spira and its institutions as a whole, I suppose.
Yeah.
What you just said about, like, is Tidus correct? Is Yuna correct? There's definitely an answer, and I think the answer is probably somewhere in the middle ground, but because you're not shown the whole truth and nothing but the truth, and I don't think that would be possible for the game to actually show it to you, there is no correct answer in this, opens it up to that ambiguity and allows for discussions like this, which is really, really cool, because I don't think other games do it quite the same way at all.
Yeah, and you've actually touched on a really interesting, like kind of what you were touching on earlier, actually, which is about talking about Buddhism and how real world things sort of can be interpreted in these games. And I've realised as I'm recording this, and I've never done anything to sort of outrightly try and upset or offend people, but you realise how tangible and relatable some of these topics are to people. So, for example, you know, there's allegories of Yevon being, is it like the Catholic Church, so on and so forth. But on the topic of familial abuse, one of the things I didn't realise until I put it out about that Jecht episode. I was talking about, the absent fathers things. There's an academic book called Absent Fathers, Lost Sons. I was using a lot of that to sort of map onto not just Tidus, but, Yuna and Seymour in this game as well. And a lot of the comments I was getting there was like, yeah, I really related to Tidus or Yuna because my dad wasn't there and stuff. And I was like, fuck, man. Like, it's so interesting how people sort of read these games based on their own subjective experiences of the world.
One of the things that always jumps out to me as well in exactly that same vein is so many of those things you don't personally think about because it doesn't affect you. And that could be for anything, whether that's being an orphan in FF8 or, having a found family in FF9 or having to deal with the cycles of abuse in FF10. There's a thread in every single game. But unless it's actually affected you personally in the real world, likely you're not going to think about it as more than just a literary device or a plot bunny. And then suddenly someone else comes along and goes, I lived through that and I feel completely differently. And you go, oh shit, okay. It's always really cool, I find.
I think it's really, really cool as well because it doors to a lot of discussion, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, so the whole Jecht-Tidus dynamic was really compelling. And I think having played it, and particularly, I think you need to dig into the game a little bit more and particularly acquire Anima from Barge Temple. But what I found on subsequent, because I don't think I got Anima on my first playthrough, but on subsequent playthroughs I did. And one thing I found I never used to like Seymour as a villain, and now actually I really find him quite interesting. But, in a lot of Final Fantasy games, there's always a sort of tenuous link between the main protagonist and then the antagonist.
Yeah.
So, for example, Sephiroth, Cloud have the Genova connection. You could argue Squall, Adir, Cypher sort of thing. Ultimisia in the guise of Adir initially, and then Zidane and Kuja are like brothers and stuff. And then you have Noctis, Ardyn. There's so many sort of links between these heroes and villains. And I was like, well, I never really grasped one between Seymour until you realise that actually he is the product of like absent parents as well. So actually it's like Tidus, Yuna and Seymour all have this same sort of trauma, I suppose, of growing up without a family unit. And then what's doubly interesting is how they each pursue the profession or kind of try and follow in the footsteps of what the absent parent was doing. So Tidus becomes a Star Blitzball player, Yuna becomes a summoner, and Seymour becomes a maester, so on. So yeah, it was really interesting stuff once you scratch it below the surface of FF10.
I think so, and it's interesting as well. You can see the parallels between those three characters. And I think, without digging in too much, because I know there's lots of stuff I'd have to dig into about the Faith and Yevon and stuff like that and how it relates to Seymour. But from what I'm getting from it, it's really Auron's character for both looking after Yuna and Tidus that really kind of, I think the argument it's making is that actually like they've had similar experiences, but it's kind of like who they are as people has really got them to where they need to be. And I think for me, the best moment in the game is the moment when your Auron flips the table against Yunalesca, and you realise that what the game's been saying the whole time is that like it's been portraying Auron as this kind of like drunk, doesn't really care, he's going to sacrifice Yuna, whatever, you need to just follow your path. And then he gets to that moment and he goes, actually, this has been my plan the whole time. You make the decision, guys. And then they make the right decision. So he's kind of not manipulated them. He has, but he hasn't manipulated them to do what he wants. He's like influenced them to bring themselves out of themselves.
Yeah.
And I think the kind of idea there is that, from what I'm getting, is that Seymour hasn't got that. He's got the kind of faith and stuff like that are manipulating him to do what they want, and he kind of reacts to it. It's a fascinating sort of like parallel that I'd love to dive down into another point, definitely.
Yeah, Auron is so compelling in that regard, because he is this bridge between past and present. He is so he's a catalyst to basically like so much that happens. And spoiler alert, I don't know when this is going out, but I do have a queued up episode called Is Final Fantasy X All About Auron? And this is following up a quip that I made while doing that tier list with the Birds of Play on my channel. To play devil's advocate, I was like, well, is Auron S tier, or is he just a guy? He's like a ghost that manipulates these kids into falling in love so he can enact his own revenge. Which I say sort of in a joking way, but there is that element of it. Like and it's interesting that, for example, when Seymour proposes to Yuna, Auron is just so blasé about it. And it's like, because to him it doesn't really matter, because he's going to get to he's going to get to Yunalesca in the end, and that's all that matters.
That's an interesting take, though, isn't it? I mean, that's. I tell you what, I'm going to ask the question now, because I know exactly when I saw Auron and saw that twist at the end, who Auron seems to be based off in fiction. Who do we think it is that he's based off in film? Let's go for film. Let's make it a bit easier.
In film,
I've just forgotten every single movie I've ever watched now. Yeah. Thanks, Jack.
Obi-Wan Kenobi.
Okay, yeah.
He's Obi-Wan Kenobi. I mean, he's a better version of Obi-Wan Kenobi, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Because basically, he's the mentor, he's not the father. He's mentored the two kids to basically get back at their dad kind of thing. And he's also a ghost. I mean, he's Obi-Wan Kenobi.
That's a good shout.
It's kind of, I mean, obviously I know that Final Fantasy is largely influenced by Star Wars anyway, but I think he's kind of that mentor, passing the torch character. But it's interesting how that's a way to look at him, that he could just not care about their personal lives and wants them to do their mission, which is something you could argue with Star Wars as well, that, like, or whatever, it doesn't really matter. You could go and kill your dad, do it, sort it out, you know what I mean? But what I think I like about this compared to, say, Star Wars, is that in Star Wars, spoiler alert for people that haven't seen Return of the Jedi by now, the whole point there is that Obi-Wan Kenobi's turning around and saying to Luke Skywalker, you need to kill your father, and then he gets there and makes his own decision and doesn't kill his father. In this one, he goes in and actually kills his father, essentially, which I think is a really interesting kind of thing. He doubles down on, actually, this is what you need to do to win, and I think it gives it a bit more of a grown-up sort of take, in a sense.
I mean, as I say, like you, I've just recently finished it and stuff, and I forgot what a tearjerker that ending is, just successively, like, and it's not just a bit with Tidus and Yuna on the airship where he disappears, which I'm not gonna lie, I got the solitary tear roll down the cheek, like, it gets me every single time. But yeah, just those final moments with Orin and Jecht, and Tidus, after so long, finally has this face-to-face with Jecht again, and he says, I hate you. And I love that because, I was watching it the other week, and it's almost like he's actually saying, I love you. He's trying to say that, but he can't do it. And I was just like, fuck, man, this game is so good.
See, that was something that I actually wanted to bring up at one point, because I know I cannot for the life of me remember the title of this video, and I apologise humbly for that. But you say pretty much that exact thing about Tidus reuniting with Jecht. I think the words that you said was, he says, I hate you, and he means I love you, and I had to stop and just burst out laughing at like the contradiction inherent in that statement anyway. But then thinking about it, and then going back to different people are going to perceive things differently, and all I could think of was, I felt that scene was so different. Like, rather than it being an expression of love, which I can completely see and I don't necessarily disagree with out of hand, but the concept of finally being able to reconnect, I suppose, in something of a controlled setting with the object of torment, I suppose, in one's life, and then being able to say fully and squarely with your whole chest, this is what you've done to me and this is how it makes me feel. Considering we see Tidus as a child say that throughout the game in those flashbacks as well, it rang very differently to me as someone who was able to escape an abusive environment. Like, knowing that my reaction to certain things would not have changed from when I was a child, but knowing that as an adult, I would be perceived differently and taken more seriously, I suppose. It really felt to me like a nice closure on Tidus's chapter of, like, coming that full circle and accepting everything that's happened, and then being able to say, I hate you, and now I can move on with my, well, not life, I suppose, but it was really interesting that was the sole point that you expounded upon in your video, because all I could think of was just like, I experienced that totally differently, and that was really cool to be able to be like, right, I'm going to needle him about this.
Yeah, fair enough. That's a fair point.
I'm not saying in any way that you're wrong either.
No, absolutely. No. And I think it does, as we've touched on a few minutes ago, there's this subjectivity that's inherent to it, and life experience and whatnot, that, you read these games differently, which I'm perfectly open to, of course. But yeah, irrespective of that, it was interesting how it certainly was closure. I mean, that statement was closure for him, and Jecht as well. We talk about, and I think you guys might have spoken about this before, but it's like talking about redemption arcs and things like this. Like, Jecht doesn't have any redemption. There's no redemption arc for Jecht, and that was also interesting to me, because he obviously goes through a transition in his life that we don't see during his own pilgrimage through Spira and stuff, but there's no real happy ever after between him and Tidus at all. Sorry, I'm just tangenting now, but what strikes me about the Final Fantasy games, particularly of this period, is that the ones that Square decided to sequelize were the ones that actually, in a way, were so much, not necessarily bleak, but they were so much more dramatic in how they ended. So thinking about Final Fantasy VII, there was only a brief window of time, really, because it felt like forever until Advent Children came out, and it came out in 2005. Like, Final Fantasy VII came out in 97, right? But during that window of time where there was no prospect of a sequel, Final Fantasy VII's ending was really like, the world blows up, and then we see Red 13 3,000 years later or whatever, looking at the ruins of Midgar, and it was like, oh, so everyone died then. Like, these were the perspectives. And it's the same with Final Fantasy X. It's like, there's no closure, Tidus disappears, and that's it. And in a way, I kind of like that. But yeah.
Unless you play the sequel.
Exactly.
Shut up, Jack. Shut
What
up,
can
Jack.
I do for you? What can I do for you? Sorry, I just thought I'd get that in.
By the way, I actually quite like Final Fantasy X too. I'm not averse to that game.
Oh, good.
do I.
We are lovers of that game here.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. I'm among friends then.
Yeah, definitely. Good game.
Yeah.
See, some of the notes that I've actually written down to talk about 10 specifically ended up spilling into 10.2, and I was kind of like, oh man, what if he hasn't played it? What if he didn't like it? Like, that could really change the answers of this. And one of them actually goes back to the overall theme of the game again. I know in one of your videos you mentioned that you don't really think that religion is so much a definitive theme in the game, so much as a vehicle to deliver other themes, which I think is a really, really valid take, actually, and a really interesting one, considering that 10 is the most religious game, at least in the Final Fantasy sense. I'm sure, Simon Plays Bible.exe is more religious. But one of the things that I've noted down here is, religion's the vehicle for 10, that's fine. Was it the right vehicle to deliver those topics? And then 10.2 completely conversely struggles with a lack of religion and people actively losing that faith and that grounding force in their lives. So my question to you is that still good? It does tend to, by completely subverting the idea of this being a very religious game and that being the central hub around all other themes being delivered, getting rid of that, does that change anything about 10? Does that make it good or bad? Or
I think looking at the games as a whole, so looking at 10 and then like 10.2, I hope this doesn't sound like a pretentious answer, but it reminds me of like the rise of existentialism, like God is dead and stuff like that. People have completely self-determinate free will. And yeah, so in a way, there's a case to suggest like is structure good, and that's one thing that strikes me about Final Fantasy X-2 is I think it's Isaru. Is he one of the other summoners? He has the two brothers that he goes around with. I think Isaru is like running some tourist business or stuff like that. He's like gone from this like really, devout sort of summoner on this pilgrimage to some guy that's just sort of lethargically trying to make a buck as a tourist, whatever he's doing. I can't quite remember. So that was interesting. That's an interesting comparison to make between, the sort of having that structure in your life, having something to sort of subscribe to, hang your hat on, and I suppose like something to sort of guide you through life, like a set of principles, even though they are dictated by an external institution. Yeah, because the thing is that, how we are now as a society, as a civilization, we like having our self-determinism and we're very sort of accustomed to it, whereas like hundreds of years ago, you would be, particularly in this country, in like Western Europe or whatever, you'd be more beholden to church and state and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think there is a conversation to have there, and it's very interesting. Again, it reminds me of Final Fantasy XII as well, where Vayne is sort of pursuing, or he says he's pursuing, I think he is, is he just a fascist dictator, or does he genuinely want to unshackle mankind from being dictated to by gods? It's a similar theme as that, I think. Does that make sense, or was I just rambling?
No, that makes complete sense.
My take is less serious than that. It's basically, if we don't have religion, we have more hot pants.
What's that one image that's been floating around the internet for years? It's like, God's dead, boyfriend's disappeared, fuck it, lesbian road trip. Like, that's just 10.2 in a nutshell.
Yeah.
Wow, that's really good take.
Have I never shown you that one before?
No, what can I do for you? I just want an excuse to sing that song. Really. One point on 10.2, because I've not finished the game, but I spoke briefly, and I think in other episodes, about how it took me a while to get into 10 and get it, because I didn't get a PS2 till later. But I remember that, like, mainly specifically guys that were into Final Fantasy at school that I knew, because I didn't know that many people that were into Final Fantasy, and it was a relatively mixed group, but let's just say the guys that I know that were into it went on about how they liked 10, but hated 10.2 because it was really girly, quote unquote, and everything like that. But then they would tell me the story beats that happened that you'd have to have played about 10 story beats to get to. So it's like, hang on a minute, you hate this game, but you've clearly played it for at least 60 hours. And it's like, I think it's one of those things where, like, actually, like, a lot of people liked this and said they didn't.
Yeah.
Guilty pleasures.
Again,
Get rid of the guilt, people.
Yeah. It's another one of those things, kind of what we were touching on earlier, about how the internet started just dogpiling on everything, and then you had this sort of mob mentality. I think Final Fantasy X-2 was very much a victim of that. Yeah,
it's a bit of a shame, really, because I think it's one of those things where we talked about. Can't remember what episode now, but it kind of extends on from the job system in 5. It's another version of the job system. It kind of does that in a kind of dress-up game as well. Yeah. It was probably just some like trick to get people to play a dress-up game. I mean, I watched. I've noticed a lot now. I get recommended stuff since I've been looking at Final Fantasy X stuff a lot more recently. I get recommended every now and then people doing tier lists of the best dress spheres, and I'm like, I kind of want to watch this.
Yeah.
Do it, Jack. Do it.
Yeah.
I just love that there's obviously someone that works at Square, because they did a similar thing with, was it Lightning Returns as well? You can sort of dress up, and there's someone that's like, let's just cosplay the girls. Can we just introduce that? Some
See,
exec
my hot take on the dressing up system is that 10.2 had the last good outfits, like alternative outfits. Every single like alternative costume that has come out in games since 10.2 has just been absolute dog shit, in my opinion, and I'm sick of it. Square Enix needs to hire a new designer.
One thing that I'm so in agreement with you, I cannot express it enough, but I think you were talking about the prospect of a Final Fantasy VIII remake and how Squall's siege uniform and cadet uniform should be unlockable, and it's like, I am so in agreement with you.
Yeah.
They are so good.
Yeah. I think I said on one of the episodes, I don't know if we recorded this, but I said that Quistis should have defaulted to the Seed uniform. That should be her outfit.
Yeah.
Because it suits her like perfectly.
Yeah.
Like that Seed uniform is that honestly like
Who
I would
among
love
us
to
has
make.
not played FF8 and then wanted that for themselves?
I want that fucking uniform. It's so smart, like so badly. Like I would make that because it's just the coolest looking thing in the world. Square Enix, send me one.
So bringing it back to 10 then again, you did just say there, Jack, that it took a while for you to get into 10, and then 10.2 was very flashy from the get-go and stuff. And I know for me personally, 10 actually took me a really, really long time to go, I get it now. I think that point actually came for me around the Macalania Woods, which was about 30 or 40 hours in and one of the last regions of the game. How long did it take for you to actually hit that moment of like, this is a good game and I'm feeling it now?
Yeah, I think as a story, there was nothing inherently wrong with it. I was always quite, as I was saying, the sort of the narrative hooks that wanted me to keep playing was like, why does everyone know who Jack is? Like those sort of things. So I was compelled. It was more the departure from what I perceived Final Fantasy to be at that time. I was like, well, where's the world map? We're just running along. I always think about the Mi'ihen High Road because it's just such a long swath of like
that's
linear
very
long
bad for
pathway.
that, yeah.
So I think the revelation I came to was not every Final Fantasy game needs to have a minified world map to make it a Final Fantasy. I was won over quite relatively quickly, and the same with the voice acting. And actually having researched latterly into the voice acting, I think the localizer was called Alexander O. Smith. And
right,
man, that guy deserves like some sort of award. Yeah, because reading about how it was done, you can notice it if you're looking out for it as well. Like Tidus and particularly Riku as well, they always tend to finish their statements with like like constantly throughout the game. The reason being is that he had to write the dialogue in English to within a fraction of a second of the video, otherwise the game would crash. And it was because it was such a fledgling, it was such a new thing for them to introduce voice acting and stuff. So a lot of people will kind of dick on the localization of that, but that guy done such a good job on it. And just as a testament to how good he is when the technology is there and he has a better rapport, so he really gets on with Yasumi Matsuno. He was also the guy that wrote the English for Final Fantasy XII, which I think
and
is
for War of the Lions as well, for
like,
Tactics, right? Yeah,
like
absolute
epic,
legend.
Epic.
And the people that don't like those localizations are wrong.
And you could argue, I don't mind the voice actor. I think I did take exception to Tidus when I first played the game. I've warmed to him, but with Final Fantasy XII, because they were going for a very kind of English Shakespearean sort of thing, they used a lot of stage actors. Whereas Final Fantasy X, I think they used a lot more sort of people that were just in the industry doing sort of Japanese translations and stuff at the time.
I noticed a few times, and probably teeters off the point you just mentioned there about getting the words into a certain period of time. There's a few moments that fall a bit flat because of how they're delivered. So I think it might have even been the bit at Yuna's wedding where I think Tidus said something like, "Oh no, don't jump," and it's like it just doesn't inconvincing at all. But like I think a lot of that is because they only had a certain amount of time to play with, and it was the first time they did it. So I think it's not necessarily because the acting was bad. It's more like going back to Star Wars again. I know that like Hayden Christensen as Anakin Skywalker gets a lot of grief, but actually when a lot of it's probably the way that George Lucas was directing him, you know what I mean? And it's one of those things where the limitations might create a different output than maybe that they could. And again, it's the first time. So I think the one thing that annoys me, and I think Mol will agree here, and I'm not sure if you will, but the scene that gets dunked on the most is the ha 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 scene.
Yeah.
But that's supposed to be stupid.
Yeah.
And if you watch that in Japanese as well, it's also dumb. like it's supposed to be them trying to let off some steam. So I think it's a bit unfair to jump on that as bad voice acting when it's literally like supposed to be bad voice acting, you know?
Yeah.
Ha 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 ha, like sort of thing.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, you're right. It's very consciously forced. Like within the scenario in the story, it is forced because they're in this very sort of, it's a very nerve-wracking scenario they're in. So it just came off as it came off, it is.
Yeah.
I know one of my friends has actually got a t-shirt with that Tidus face on it, and it cracks me up every time she wears it.
Yeah.
It's a good meme.
I've used it for a couple of thumbnails lately, actually. Yeah, I love it.
Yeah. I mean, I do think that Lulu's voice actress does a good performance all the way through. I think she's pretty good.
Yeah.
I do like. I think I've mentioned this before, and it might have been referencing Kuja, but Seymour has that kind of like him from the Powerpuff Girls vibe going on, where he speaks all high like this lady, and then when he gets and he transforms, gets a deeper voice and goes, I'm going to kill you. And that's actually quite horrifying.
Yeah.
I think it's where you fight him on Mount Gagazet, and he's Seymour Flux, I think.
Yeah. I think
right. And then like he starts off and he's there underdressed for the weather with his sort of with his chest out, and he's like, I've killed all of the whatever Kamari's race is called, I've forgotten.
Yeah, the Ronso.
I've killed all the Ronso, la 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 la, and then all of a sudden, like, Tidus insults him, and he goes, well, and it's like, whoa, okay, don't want to cross this dude.
Yeah, the line he actually says, and that's another one that hits really well. I think he says something like, would the last Ronso want to do? And he calls it the last Ronso, and I was just like, oh, you just think about all the people you've just met, and they're all dead, and it's like, damn, man.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's sort of Seymour is. They seem to do it really well with Seymour. We've nicely segued into a discussion about him, where he appears less threatening than he is. Yeah, in a sense.
Yeah, see, I think I mentioned Seymour. I kind of did a bit of a U-turn on him because I realised why he was written the way he was. So for him, I think his English voice acting is a bit, I want to say, kind of campy. And actually, they have this in Japanese anime. A lot of the English translations, for some reason, antagonists always have this slightly sort of high-pitched, like campy voice about them. I don't know why, but it was immediately obvious from the way he spoke and his theme music as soon as you meet him that he's the bad guy. Like, it's a very, very menacing vibe. And I was like, if you think about the previous games, like Kuja was the sort of character that's pulling the strings behind the curtain. He doesn't really get revealed until a bit later, and even then his intentions are wrapped up. Could say the same for Ultimisia, and then Sephiroth, who is very much like Jaws. You just don't see Sephiroth at all, and it was really compelling how they build it up. So by comparison, we meet Seymour quite early on, and it's obvious he's the bad guy, and I was like, well, why have they spoiled this? There's no man behind the curtain, there's no real build up to his character. But actually what's really interesting, and this is quite unique to him, is that where the other examples I've just given, they are sort of obviously the bad guys from the outset, Seymour is actually like a celebrated public figure. People love him. So the thing is like, we know he's the bad guy. We're supposed to know he's the bad guy, but nobody else does.
Okay, that's interesting. I like that.
Tidus and Yuna couldn't just turn around and be like, this guy's an evil bastard, he's going to kill us all. Because the people will be like, no, he's a maester. Like, what are you talking about?
Yeah, I suppose that ties in with Walker as well, because Walker will make comments like, oh, I'm really sorry, Mr. Maester, when you got to fight him and stuff like that. That's interesting.
Yeah, so
I like that.
So I did really like how, and again, this took subsequent playthroughs and stuff for me to really appreciate his character's involvement and the way he was written there. So yeah, it was cool. His
last boss battle's a bit of a breeze, though, isn't it? Like, I mean,
yeah. So going back to whether we're good at games or not, I've always focused primarily on story. So I'm not someone that will grind through games. I will just play through because I want to find out what happens. So I always used to find Seymour a bit.
I'm exactly the same way.
Yeah. On this playthrough, I was actually like, I'm going to grind. I'm going to do the Dark Aeons to the extent that I can, and I did most of the stuff. So actually, yeah, by the time I got to Seymour, it was like his final iteration inside Sin was like 2 hits, I think.
It's really interesting how like the structure of the game from a mechanical perspective, it is like, obviously the game's very linear, but it is also very linear in it, and it's we talked about tutorials in 8. It's very like, a tutorial through it. It's teaching you what you need to do to beat certain enemies. So when you fight Seymour Flux, I think it is, on top of Mount Gagazet, that is notorious for being a big bottleneck for a lot of people. And I've seen it because I struggled with it when I did it recently, and I looked on the YouTube comments, and people are like, "Wow, now I know how to do of a guide to how to do it," and everyone like, "Wow, I've not played this game or beaten this game in 20 years, and you finally let me know how to get past it." And it's like, okay, that's really interesting, but it is interesting how like when you open up and you can get access to the airship and you can grind and build a sphere grid or whatever, the game does become a bit of a breeze. I think the last boss gave me a bit of trouble because of the stupid trick with No, I think it's if you throw the Aeons at the last boss and you kill those 2 sort of stone pillars that are next to Jet at the end, whatever damage you do to them is the health that they come back with.
Yes.
So that's a real beginner's trap, because what ends up happening is you end up taking more and more damage. So what you have to do is really use your dual cast and then take them both out first and then attack them. And it's a bit of a puzzle, which I quite like. But I think towards the end it's better because you've got more options on how to solve that puzzle. We spoke in either the Final Fantasy III episode or Final Fantasy V episode about how Final Fantasy III, being a bit more old school, really it puts you down that path of having to solve the puzzle a certain way or brute force it, whereas 5 gives you multiple options. And I think 10's kind of like the middle ground between both of them, because of the first half of the game is very much like, here's the way you need to solve this, lol. And then the second half is kind of like, you can do it a different way. You can like grind flipping Una up to be able to cast whatever, and it's quite interesting. But I will ask you, I know you just mentioned there about the story focus. Is there a particular boss that gave you trouble? Because this is an interesting topic, I think.
Okay, I'm gonna come clean here, because I basically cheat my way through Final Fantasy. So FFA Ultimecia is like a really long drawn out battle.
Yeah,
Fuck that fight.
Yeah, I just always refine the Laguna card, so I get 100 heroes. So I'm invincible for that entire battle. With Final Fantasy X, I basically just Zanmato everything. Like, so I done the Dark Aeons. It was just Zanmato. Get more money, Zanmato. Everything was just Zanmato. But you're right. I think on all of the Seymour battles. So the first one in the temple, where, because he's got those 2 guards by him that always heal.
Yeah.
I think I got game overed by him once or twice, and then the one on Gagazet, I got game overed by him once or twice. I also got game overed by Baran and Yankee, but the only reason being is that actually for Kamari's Lancet
Overdrive.
You can draw loads of stuff from them, like Mighty Guard and White Wind and everything. So I was just there, like, just trying to draw everything, and they ended up wearing me down. But yeah, so I think this time around. Oh no, I didn't do Omega Weapon this time. I got to him, and is it Omega Weapon or Ultimate? I think it's Omega Weapon. You can go.
I think it's Omega.
Yeah, it's Omega. Yeah, so I'd done all of the things to get to him. Sort of. Yeah, I fought him once, and he game overed me, and I was just like, I'm just going to complete the game now. Couldn't be bothered.
Yeah, no, it's just interesting because I've been watching quite a bit of stuff. People talk about Final Fantasy X in recent months, and there's quite a lot of content on YouTube talks about bosses and stuff like that. And Final Fantasy X, like, is quite, for want of a better term, famous for its boss encounters. And a lot of people talk about Unalesca being an absolute.
Oh god, yeah.
If you didn't bring that up, I was going to.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. So the second form where she's got that Medusa, or is it the third form where the Medusa head comes out? Yeah, that is awful. Yeah, I did struggle with that this time.
See, that's really interesting, because every single time that I've ever heard anyone talk about Unalesca, it's always been, man, fuck that fight. It was really hard. To the point when I played 10 for the first time, I was bricking it when I came up to her.
Yeah.
First try, no trouble. And
I was like,
I did the first time. What the fuck? And I'm not good at games.
I did it first try as well, but I think it's basically because you had that. I mean, I think I had the same experience where, like, I was dreading Unalesca, so I grinded quite a bit beforehand and then made sure I knew what the strategy was. And as soon as you know the strategy, you kind of breeze it. But yeah, if you, as a beginner's trap, it's going to be like, why am I dying? What's going on? It's interesting.
Yeah, I think that the main trouble I had in that point, right, is you're in that area in the Xanacan ruins where you've beaten Unalesca. You have one opportunity to, I think you go down the stairs and you can get a chest which has the Sun Crest or something to do with one of the ultimate weapons, right? And I forgot it the first time round. But if you go back in, it's Dark Bahamut is there. And I was like, for fuck's sake. So I really wanted to get Tidus's ultimate weapon, so I had to just get enough gil to Zanmato Dark Bahamut.
No, it's an interesting strategy. I mean, I get it. I mean, I can understand. I mean, what I like about some of the remasters of the PS1 games, I mean, I think I've got problems with the version of 8 they've got there with the I don't like Squall's character model and that, and I think there's some parts of that have problems, but I do like the fact you can speed stuff up, and like you can put 9999 mode or limit break mode on some of those games to zip through them. Yeah, because, and especially in the pixel remasters of the first 6 games where you can turn encounters off, because it does, like you say, if you're in the mood to just play the game story, you can just do it and just press X and smash through it.
No, that's a great point. And actually, so they did it with the Zodiac Age as well. As I say, I'm playing through Final Fantasy XII again, and it's actually the reason I've got these games now is I found them really well discounted. So I got Final Fantasy X for the PS4 version and the Zodiac Age, because during COVID I got my PS2 out and I was like, I'm going to play Final Fantasy X again. I don't know if you've tried playing the PS2 on like a big modern HD screen.
It fucking sucks.
Oh, it looks awful. And I was like, no, I need to rebuy these games like in HD quality.
You need component cables. That's what you need.
Yeah.
Which they stopped putting into the TV I have is like I think one of the last models that has component cables in it that lets you plug in. Was it? I can't remember. It's one of the. It's basically during that. This is me getting into the techie of like a video footage for games. It came out before HDMI came out, so I think the Dreamcast had the S-Video port, and the PS2 had this at SCART, but you could also plug in component, which gave you I think 720p.
Right. Okay.
So that's how you make PS2 games look good. And it would, if you had those cables, it would look a lot better. But of course, it's very specific to the PS2.
Yeah.
Not a lot of things had it. Now everything's got HDMI. Unless you got a TV from like 5, 6, 7 years ago, forget
Which,
it. So.
don't get me started on that, because I had a real nostalgic desire to get one of those little, shitty 12-inch TVs with the built-in DVD player, just so I could have it in the corner of my room. And people are trying to sell them these days for like £100, and it's like it's marketed as a gaming TV, and I'm like, man, no. I remember when these cost £20, but anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
But anyway,
you had 3 of them. Like,
yeah, sorry, I'm taking a very scenic route to the point here. But so playing Final Fantasy XII now, I had to look at a walkthrough video on YouTube for the bit I was doing. I was going through the Goldmoor jungle or something. And yeah, I didn't realise until I watched this YouTube video, this guy's doing it at *4 speed, like running through the jungle. And I realised you can do it on the Zodiac Age, the PS4 version. I was like, this is brilliant. It's saving me so much time.
Yeah, that's amazing, isn't it? It's like, I don't want to go across that desert and fight the rogue tomato. I just want to zip through. Fucking rogue tomato. I think I mentioned this online. If I've not, I might be thrusting this on you. But we've got a little... Well, you heard this in the May episode. We've got a little... Who Said What quiz for Final Fantasy X.
I've been dreading this, but yeah. I did hear you do it with May, so yeah.
Okay, brilliant. But it's okay. No one's going to judge you. Should we take them and take it in turns again, Mol?
Yeah, go on first? If you want to go first.
Let's do the silly voice type thing. So, question 1 in the Final Fantasy X, Who Said What? The first one is, see, I told you she gets mad easily.
Is that Waka talking about Lulu?
It is indeed. There we go. You started off well. Well done.
Number 2 then is, he's Lord Jiskel no more. Send him now.
Orin.
Ooh, final answer?
Don't make me say... No, because Orin wasn't there, because that's in the far plane. But it sounds like an Orinism. I don't know.
That one's Lulu, I'm afraid.
Okay.
Just after the far plane. Right. 3. Die and fight your pain, or live and fight your sorrow.
That's Orin.
There we go.
Yeah, the Yugaleska battle. That is a fantastic line. Yeah.
The best line of the game. Yeah.
I will interject to say I love the concept of an Orinism, by the way.
Yeah.
Number 4. Men die. Beasts die. Trees die. Even continents perish. Only the power of death truly commands in Spira.
I think that's Maester Micah.
Oh, you are good at this. You said you were bricking it, but that's correct.
That is correct. When you find out he's unsensed, that is when that is. Okay, final one.
Jack, I want to hear your best voice for this one.
It's the lightning's fault.
Tidus? I don't know. No. It's the lightning's fault. I mean, I'm assuming this is the Thunder Plains, is it?
Yeah. We'll give you half a point on that alone, I think.
Is it Riku?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
It is Riku in the Thunder Plains when she gets really upset about the thunder and lightning and decides she's going to hide.
You know, Jack, I was fully expecting you to clear your throat and then just do your normal voice when you said that one.
It's the lightning's fault, mate. No. I think I can do the "Hey lady, you know, ha ha ha" sort of voice, but I can't do the proper femme voice very well. Doing an impression of Riku is not my jam. Cool, brilliant. Well, I think you got 4.5 there.
I'll take it.
Is it 3.5 you got? Oh, whatever. You did well. It was fun. Yeah, whatever. That was fun. So thanks very much for that. I really, really, really enjoyed talking to you.
Yes, thank you so much for your time and coming on and being able to talk about this. It's been a really, really good conversation.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah,
it's
I'd love to do something like this again at some point, hopefully.
I would love that. And yeah, thank you for having me on. It's been great chatting to you guys. Really enjoyed it. So
question for you then, Will. Where can everyone find you online?
They can find me online under AlleywayJack is my YouTube channel. I'm available there. Also have Blue Sky now, and also Twitter. I think like a lot of people, I'm sort of hovering between the two. But yeah, I tend to use those to sort of mainly retweet other people and keep people updated about latest videos I have. Yeah, youtube.com/AlleywayJack.
Excellent. Everyone go and give them a sub. What about yourself, Jack? Where can we find you?
So, same, obviously, we are EXP Required on YouTube and Spotify and other places, and I am just about on Twitter, but Blue Sky, I'm JackieBoy34.
Yeah, likewise, hovering between Twitter and Blue Sky. It's very much up to whether or not, or which one dies first, I think. But I will be a Dramalek on everything as far as a personal account goes, and likewise, EXP Required is also on both Twitter and Blue Sky.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. See you guys later. Cheers.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.